morning sun had barely broken over the horizon at Pearl Harbor when Admiral Chester W. Nimitz arrived at his headquarters on May 27, 1942. The air was heavy with salt and tension, the kind that settles when the outcome of a war seems to hinge on invisible information. Nimitz, calm but wary, stepped into the intelligence briefing room. The lights were dim. Maps of the Pacific were pinned to the wall, covered in colored pins and grease pencil marking. In the center of the table sat Lieutenant Commander Edwin T. Layton, his intelligence officer, holding a stack of decoded reports from Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's cryptographic unit buried deep beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor. Layton looked up as Nimitz entered, his face pale from exhaustion, but his eyes burning with conviction. "Sir," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the word, "we know where they're coming. We know when. We know how." The Admiral took his seat without speaking. Layton unfolded the top sheet, revealing carefully typed intercept, numerical sequences, and translation that to anyone else would look like nonsense. But to Nimitz, they were the threads of Japan's most secret plan. The Japanese fleet, the same one that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was preparing for another strike. The target, a small coral atoll called Midway, 2 dots of sand and reef that stood between Hawaii and the vastness of the Western Pacific. For Japan, capturing Midway meant pushing the United States out of the Central Pacific, threatening Hawaii itself, and forcing a peace on Japanese terms. For the American, it meant the chance to turn the tide of the war. Layton continued, "Our analysts at Station Hypo have decrypted key portions of the JN-25B code. We've identified the target designated as AF. All communications, supply orders, and air preparations point to Midway. We're certain of it." The Admiral glanced at the wall clock. 0800 hours. It had been exactly 6 months since the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor. In those 6 months, the United States had lost territory across the Pacific. Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines. The Japanese fleet seemed unstoppable. But here, in this quiet intelligence room, Nimitz held something more powerful than any battleship. He held knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could win wars before a shot was fired. The path to this moment had begun years before anyone had heard of Midway. Back in 1924, a young naval officer named Lawrence F. Safford believed the next great war would be fought not only with steel and gunpowder, but with information. He convinced the Navy to establish its first permanent cryptologic office, OP-20G, inside a small room in Washington, D.C. Safford recruited a handful of men who could think differently: mathematicians, linguists, radio operators, and puzzle solvers. Among them was a young sailor who would one day become a legend in naval cryptology, Joseph J. Rochefort. Rochefort was a wiry man with sharp features, known for his dry wit and a mind that could untangle any pattern. In 1929, he was sent to Japan to study the language and culture. For 3 years, he lived in Tokyo, learning the habits of Japanese officers, the rhythm of their communication, the subtleties of their military phrases. He returned fluent not only in the language, but in the mindset of Japan's Navy. When the Japanese introduced their new naval code in 1939, known to the Americans as JN-25, Rochefort was among the first to study it. JN-25 wasn't just a simple cipher. It was a double-enciphered code built from tens of thousands of number groups. Each word or phrase was represented by a 5-digit number, then scrambled by an additive, another number taken from a separate, frequently changing table. It was a mathematical labyrinth designed to be unbreakable. By late 1941, American cryptanalysts had managed to recover roughly 10% of the JN-25 codebook. It wasn't much, a few ship names, common words, operational phrases, but it was enough to give glimpses of Japan's movement. Then, just 3 days before the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese changed their additive table, blinding American codebreakers in the worst possible moment. When bombs fell on December 7, 1941, the men of Station Hypo felt the sting personally. To them, the attack wasn't just a military defeat, it was proof that they had failed to warn their country in time. After the smoke cleared, Rochefort and his team buried themselves deeper in their underground station at Pearl Harbor. The room was narrow, windowless, and filled with clattering IBM punch card machines. The air smelled of tobacco and coffee. The men inside, linguists, mathematicians, radio operators, and puzzle solvers, worked in shifts so long they sometimes forgot what day it was. Many were former musicians from the battleship band sunk at Pearl Harbor. Their sense of rhythm made them naturals at detecting recurring patterns in encrypted code groups. Rochefort himself often worked 72 hours straight, pacing barefoot in his smoking jacket and slippers. muttering calculations under his breath. He believed that breaking JN-25 wasn't just a task of logic, but of intuition, of feeling how the enemy thought. By January 1942, the first cracks appeared. The Americans could read about 1 in 5 words of intercepted Japanese naval traffic. That sliver of comprehension was enough to detect pattern, enough to sense when major fleet movements were underway. It was through these fragments that Nimitz began to shape his early strategy. When Japan struck the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, U.S. cryptologists were already tracking the buildup. The information wasn't perfect, but it was enough to give American forces just enough warning to hold the line. Then, in late April 1942, a new flurry of messages began appearing. They mentioned an operation involving a location referred to only as AF. Dozens of orders referenced supply convoys, air patrols, and fuel allocation, all tied to this single code group. It was clear Japan was preparing something big. The only question was where. Rochefort and his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, began comparing AF with other known designations. They noticed that A codes typically referred to areas around Hawaii. AH had been used for Oahu, AP for Pearl Harbor. Logic suggested that AF was Midway Atoll, the tiny U.S. outpost roughly halfway between Hawaii and the vastness of the Western Pacific. For Japan, capturing Midway meant pushing the United States out of the Central Pacific, threatening Hawaii itself, and forcing a peace on Japanese terms. For the Americans, it meant the chance to turn the tide of the war. But Washington wasn't convinced. Analysts at the Navy Department's Communication Intelligence Office, OP-20G, argued that AF might refer to the Aleutian Islands or even Johnston Island. Some thought the Japanese were planning to strike north or south, not at the center of the Pacific. Without proof, Nimitz couldn't risk everything on a hunch. That proof came from an idea so simple it bordered on genius. One of Rochefort's team members, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed a test. Midway, he suggested, should send a radio message in plain English reporting a breakdown in its freshwater system, something innocuous but urgent. If the Japanese were indeed referring to Midway as AF, their next encrypted messages would likely mention a water shortage. On May 19, 1942, with Nimitz's approval, the coded instruction went out via secure cable to Midway. The next day, Midway transmitted the fake message, unencrypted, as if by accident. AF is short of water, desalination plant inoperative, need fresh water supplies immediately. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message addressed to Naval Headquarters in Tokyo. It stated that AF reports a water shortage. That was it. Absolute confirmation. AF was Midway. The basement erupted in quiet cheers. After months of exhaustion and doubt, they had their answer. Rochefort sent word immediately to Leighton, who carried it to Nimitz. The admiral, always composed, allowed himself a brief nod. "That's it," he said. "Prepare the fleet." Now the real work began. The Japanese plan, Operation MI, called for a massive fleet, 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, a dozen cruisers, and an invasion force. The goal was to lure the American carriers into a trap, crush them, and seize Midway. What the Japanese didn't know was that the trap had already been reversed. Through late May, the cryptanalysts at Hypo worked feverishly, decoding fragments of new messages that revealed details of the operation. They learned that the attack would come around June 4th from the northwest and that Japanese aircraft would launch at dawn. The Americans also intercepted details of a diversionary attack planned for the Aleutians, meant to draw attention north. On May 27, 1942, the date that would mark a turning point in naval history, Leighton stood once more in front of Admiral Nimitz. His report was astonishingly precise. The Japanese will approach from bearing 325 degrees, roughly 175 miles from Midway. They will launch at 0700 hours on June 4th. Nimitz asked, "You're certain?" "Yes, sir. We're reading their plans directly. We can follow every movement, every order, every signal between their commanders." For a moment, the admiral said nothing. Then he turned to the map. "Very well," he said quietly. "Let's meet them." The trap was set. Nimitz ordered his 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, to position themselves northeast of Midway, exactly where the Japanese wouldn't expect them. Yorktown, heavily damaged in the Coral Sea battle just weeks earlier, was in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. Navy engineers estimated it would take 3 months to repair. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Over 1,400 shipyard workers labored around the clock, patching holes, welding plates, and restoring flight operations. The island of Oahu went dark as power was diverted to the shipyard. 72 hours later, Yorktown sailed again, her decks still smelling of fresh paint, her repair crews still aboard. By June 3rd, reconnaissance aircraft from Midway spotted the first Japanese ships. On the morning of June 4th, radar operators detected the main strike force approaching from the northwest, exactly as predicted. At 07:02 hours, just 2 minutes later than Layton's forecast, the Japanese launched their first wave of bombers at Midway. But when they looked for the American carriers, they found nothing. The U.S. fleet was already in position, silent, waiting. The ensuing Battle of Midway would last 4 days, from June 4th to June 7th, 1942. It was chaos, fire, and steel against the endless blue. But by the end of it, Japan had lost 4 of its front-line carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The U.S. lost Yorktown and a destroyer, Hamon, but the strategic victory was complete. Japan's carrier strike power was broken, and it would never recover. When Nimitz received the battle reports, he looked at Layton and said, "Your estimates were off, by 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles. Then he smiled. It was one of the most accurate predictions in naval warfare history. After the victory at Midway, word of the triumph spread slowly across the Pacific. In the dim corridors of Station Hypo, the men who had worked in secret for months received no parades or medals. Most of them were still hunched over their desks, decoding new intercepts, while the rest of the world celebrated a battle they had quietly won before it began. Joseph Rochefort, exhausted and pale, leaned back in his chair for the first time in days. He had not slept for nearly a week. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, and the floor was littered with scraps of paper filled with 5-digit groups and notes written in hurried pencil. Outside, the harbor glistened under the Hawaiian sun. Ships were being repaired, planes refueled, sailors rushing to and from their stations. To them, the battle had been a victory of courage, of pilots and guns and torpedoes. But to Rochefort and his cryptanalysts, it was a victory of thought. The invisible kind of warfare fought with intellect, patience, and an unyielding faith in logic. That evening, Admiral Nimitz sent a short formal note to Rochefort's team. "You have saved the lives of many Americans. You have changed the course of the war. The results speak for themselves." It was a rare acknowledgement from a man known for understatement. Yet even that praise could not fully capture what had been achieved. To understand why the victory was so monumental, one must look beyond the numbers of ships sunk and planes destroyed. Midway marked the point where the United States shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had been decisively beaten, and it had been done not by chance, but by information. In Tokyo, the news of the defeat was met with disbelief. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy and the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, refused at first to accept the reports. His entire plan had been based on the assumption of surprise. The Americans, he believed, would be unprepared, confused, and scattered. That they had been waiting, perfectly positioned, was incomprehensible. Somewhere, somehow, Japan's greatest secret had been exposed. But the Japanese had no idea how deep the breach ran. The Americans were not just reading fragments of their messages, they were reading almost everything: routes, timings, unit assignments, even personal correspondence. The work of Station Hypo and of its sister stations in Melbourne and Washington had turned the once mysterious Japanese naval code into an open book. Still, even after Midway, the secrecy surrounding code-breaking remained absolute. The U.S. Navy classified all references to JN-25 and its decryption. The pilots who flew the Midway missions were told that the victory had come from luck and brilliant reconnaissance. To reveal the truth would risk alerting the Japanese that their code was compromised. So the men of Hypo returned to their machines, uncelebrated and unknown. Rochefort, meanwhile, found himself facing a different kind of battle, one fought not with ciphers, but with bureaucracy. Despite his success, officers in Washington, including his rival John Redmond of OP20.G, argued that the victory had come from their analysis, not Rochefort's. They accused him of insubordination, of operating too independently, of lacking proper military decorum. It was a bitter irony. The man whose team had made the victory possible was quietly reassigned. By mid-1942, Rochefort was removed from Hypo and sent to command a floating dry dock, far from the work that had defined his career. Nimitz was furious but powerless to reverse the decision. He knew the value of Rochefort's contribution and often spoke of him with respect. He did it with one hand tied behind his back, Nimitz later said. He was one of the very few who could see the enemy through the fog of war. Even after Rochefort's reassignment, the system he built continued to thrive. His team, men like Jasper Holmes, Thomas Dyer, and Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, continued decoding Japanese signals throughout 1943 and 1944. They tracked the movements of submarines, supply convoys, and new aircraft carriers. Their work guided Admiral Raymond Spruance's decisions at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where the Japanese lost nearly 400 aircraft in a single day, an engagement that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the roots of that triumph, like Midway, lay in the intelligence breakthroughs of 1942. Each intercepted message, each recovered code group, had begun a chain of understanding that turned the tide of the entire Pacific War. The process of decoding JN-25 was far from glamorous. The code was built from a 33,333 group dictionary, each representing a word, number, or phrase. The Japanese changed their additive tables frequently, forcing the Americans to start over again and again. Every day, Hypo's analysts manually compared intercepts, looking for repetition. When the same 5-digit group appeared twice with different additives, the difference between them revealed a clue. It was mathematical archaeology, slow, meticulous, and mentally exhausting. To manage the flood of intercepts, the Navy used a network of Y stations scattered across the Pacific. These radio listening posts, manned by operators with headphones and notebooks, captured enemy transmissions, which were then flown or cabled to the central decoding hubs. Each intercepted message might take hours to transcribe and days to analyze. Yet little by little, patterns emerged: ship movements, supply schedules, convoy routes. By the spring of 1942, Station Hypo was reading roughly 15% of JN-25 traffic. By early 1943, that number rose to nearly 85%. It was enough to give the U.S. Navy a near-complete picture of Japanese operations. The effects of that advantage rippled through every major battle. When American submarines began targeting Japanese supply convoys in 1943, they already knew the routes. When the U.S. Navy prepared for the invasions of Tarawa, the Marshalls, and the Marianas, it did so with foreknowledge of Japanese defenses. Even Yamamoto himself, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, fell victim to American code-breaking. In April 1943, Hypo intercepted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour in the Solomon Islands. The decrypted text listed his exact route, the aircraft he would fly in, and the time of his arrival. Armed with this information, Nimitz authorized Operation Vengeance, a daring ambush by US P-38 Lightning fighters. On April 18th, Yamamoto's plane was intercepted and shot down over Bougainville. Japan's most brilliant naval strategist died without ever realizing that his own communications had led the enemy straight to him. For the Americans, this marked another quiet triumph of signals intelligence. For the Japanese, it was a devastating revelation that something, though they did not yet know what, had gone terribly wrong with their code security. Back in the United States, the work of naval cryptography expanded dramatically. New code-breaking centers were established in Washington, Melbourne, and even aboard ships. Thousands of women joined the Navy's WAVES program, trained in cryptanalysis and traffic analysis. Many were mathematicians, teachers, or linguists who had never expected to serve in war. Their work was tedious and classified, but it was critical. Together, they processed hundreds of thousands of intercepts every month, feeding raw data to analysts like those at Hypo. Yet even as the system grew, the heart of naval cryptology remained the same, the combination of logic, intuition, and sheer persistence that had broken JN-25 before Midway. It was a process that blurred the line between science and art, between calculation and instinct. Rochefort once described it as feeling the heartbeat of the enemy through numbers. The Battle of Midway, then, was not merely a naval engagement. It was the first great victory of modern intelligence, a demonstration that wars could be won not only by strength, but by information. It was the moment when Admiral Nimitz realized that his enemy's secrets were no longer secrets at all. On that morning of May 27, 1942, when Leighton handed him the decrypted message confirming Midway as the target, Nimitz understood something profound, that the power of foresight, earned through patient, invisible work, could change the course of history. He knew that from then on, the Japanese would never again move unseen. That realization became the foundation of every operation that followed. When the U.S. advanced across the Central Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan to Guam, the fleet moved with the confidence of men who knew what awaited them. When carrier groups clashed over the Philippine Sea, their strikes were guided not only by radar, but by decoded signals hours or even days in advance. The intelligence edge that began with Rochefort's basement would eventually grow into a global network, one that predicted enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. As the war drew toward its end in 1945 and Japan's navy lay shattered, Nimitz reflected on the strange silent weapon that had made it possible. He later wrote that the knowledge of the enemy's intentions gained through cryptanalysis was the most decisive factor in our victory in the Pacific. For decades after the war, the full story remained secret. Rochefort's role was buried in classified archives, his achievements unrecognized. Only in 1986, 44 years after Midway, did the U.S. Navy formally award him the Distinguished Service Medal. By then, Rochefort had long since passed away. The medal was presented to his family, accompanied by a citation that read, "For outstanding service in the field of cryptanalysis, which contributed directly to the success at Midway and to the security of the United States." Admiral Nimitz's intuition on that May morning had been correct. He could indeed read every Japanese secret, and because of that, he could outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately outfight an enemy that had once seemed invincible. In the end, the story of May 27, 1942, is not just about war. It's about the quiet power of knowledge, the persistence of men who refused to give up, and the moment when one admiral realized that the invisible could be more powerful than the visible. It is the story of how the codebreakers beneath Pearl Harbor changed the destiny of nations, one intercepted message at a time.